In our previous session a few weeks ago, we discussed Masechet Berachot or Berachot 3a. And as we progressed through that particular section in the Talmud, we came across something very interesting. It was a discussion between Rabbi Yossi and Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. And the story, of course, was that Rabbi Yossi had gone into a ruin that was part of the ruins around the city of Jerusalem. And as a consequence of him going in, it's for the reason of prayer. Eliyahu Hanavi appears. He seems to keep guard over him, shall we say, while he's praying. And then he has a conversation with him, asking him why he had gone into the ruin, why didn't he pray along the way. And they have an extensive exchange that reveals something quite amazing. The most interesting part of that discussion was the fact that Eliyahu Hanavi talks about the reaction, one might say, of Hashem listening to the prayers of the people of Israel as they enter into the synagogues and into the study halls, and that in essence he garners comfort from the praises that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, proclaim. And it was an amazing statement because in some sense we discussed this, that God, Hashem, needs our prayers. It's not simply, one might say, a one-way street that we ask Hashem for things, but in essence, we give something to Hashem. Now, at the end of that discussion, we see that Eliyahu Hanavi, obviously transmitting this conversation with Rabbi Yossi takes something away from that. And we're going to look at that section today at the very end. And it says here, Tanur Rabbanan mipinei shelosha devarim en nichnasin lechurba mipinei chashad mipinei hapoelet ומפני המזיקין, מפני חשד, ותקפוק משום הפולת. Now this is very interesting. It tells us, the Tanur Rabbanan, this portion here, tells us that this is a baraita, the rabbis taught. And it says, מפני שלושה דברים. Essentially, we learn three things. There are three things that we derive from this. And nichnasin lechurba, for which we should not enter into a ruin. That is, there are three reasons why we should not do so. The first one is mipnei chashad. The first one is because of suspicion. The next one is mipnei hapolet, which is the fear of the building collapsing, the ruin collapsing. And then the last one is mipnei hamazikin. And a mazik is a destroyer. This is a plural form, the destroyers. This is a reference to shadim, to demons, who are those who damage. And so we have essentially three reasons. We have the concern over sexual immorality, suspicion that if one goes into a ruin, other people might suspect or believe that that individual is doing something wrong. It's the physical safety, mapolet, which is the question of the building falling down, and then over the concern over demons. And then it says mipnei chashad. So, the suspicion, the issue of suspicion, v'tikpok le mishun hapolet. Should we instead derive, the halacha about not entering into a ruin on the basis of the concern over the building falling? And so now what we do is we're going to turn to a different section, which is 3b. Let me share this. And this is a continuation of that section that we just looked at. Now, in many ways, this section, 3b of Tractate Berachot, is somewhat more dense. It's a little bit more complicated. There doesn't seem to be one key idea that we might compare to the previous section, where we had this tremendous dialogue regarding a bat kol, a divine voice, the fact that Hashem, in essence, is mourning for the destruction of the temple, of his palace, and the fact that he's exiled his children far from their father's table. And then the corresponding statement that when the children of Israel pray, that Hashem is, in essence, comforted. This section is approaching this topic, or not that necessarily that topic, but the discussion in a very different light. Here we see, I think, the sparseness or the economy of the language that the Gemara sometimes employs. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we will have a one-word response to a question. And in many ways, we're dependent upon Rashi or other commentators to sort of help fill the understanding of these passages. And what we, in essence, have in the discourse that follows is that the rabbis are looking at the three reasons that were given why an individual should not enter into a ruin. Of course, just to rename them again, the concern or the suspicion that something improper is being performed, a sexual act, prostitution. Another concern was that the building might collapse. And the third one is over the concern over demons. Now, the reason that the rabbis are going to break these different reasons down is to consider why three reasons are given. Why not simply mention one and have it apply across the board? And what we're going to find, in essence, is that the reason that these multiple reasons are given is because they don't apply in every case. And so when they don't apply in one particular case, the other two or another one might actually be applicable in that particular scenario. So here we come across the first one. This is sort of that sparseness of language. It says bechadti. Bechadti, what does that mean? This is referring to a new building. This is, think about the word chadash in Hebrew. Of course, we are looking at this in a different context, but bechadti in the Aramaic is telling us what? That this is a new building. So does this concern over the building falling actually apply to this case? If it's a newly abandoned building, if it was recently destroyed, if people just moved out, should that really be a concern? And so the Gemara, while it brings up this question, if you will, or this objection, it answers it and it says, well, batikpok le mishum hamazikin. Well, then should we establish this law, if you will, this halacha, from the concern over demons or the damagers, if you will? And then, based on this, it responds again with one word, and it says bitre, which refers to two. Now, why is this important? If we look at Tractate Berachot 34b, there is an argument or there is a perspective that demons can appear to one individual and cause harm. Demons can appear to two individuals, but they do not cause harm. And demons can not appear or cause harm to three individuals. And so the reason that this is brought up is because if there are two individuals present, in essence, should this not cancel the concern over demons? And in fact, it says, ibitri hashad name leka. But it turns it in a different direction. Why? Because if there are two individuals present, we know, according to another section of the Talmud, that demons are not a factor, at least in this particular case. But it also says if there are two present, hashad name leka, the concern over immorality is also not there. And why is this the case? Well, if you're talking about two regular individuals, most individuals would not do something immoral in the presence of another individual. But then the Talmud sort of answers this objection, if you will, and it says, bitre uf ritzi. Well, what about if the two individuals are immoral? They're of low moral stature. Maybe they're simply wicked individuals. Well, obviously, in that particular case, the concern over immorality would still hold true, because you could have 10 individuals enter into an abandoned building, and since they are not shomrei mitzvot, and they're not keepers of the Torah, they're not observant, then they wouldn't have any compunction not to do something that was wrong. So perhaps you can see how the Talmud, the Gemara, is coming up with different scenarios. It believes that one concern is not applicable, and then it brings up another, and then it sort of goes through the cycle. And it continues, and it says, Mipenei hapolet. Well, if that's the case, are we concerned about the walls falling down or the building collapsing? And it says, V'tipok le mishum chashad u'mazikim. Well, in that case, should we establish the halacha on the basis of suspicion and demons? And then it gives us another objection or answer. It says, bitre uch shere. Well, what about if the two individuals, and you can see the root word here, kasher, if you will. What about if they're two outstanding individuals? They're kosher individuals, they're shomrei mitzvot, they're tzaddikim, if you will, they're righteous individuals. Is that a concern? Does that not nullify, back to the question of suspicion, that concern? And if that's the case, what about mipinei chamazikin? Should we be concerned about demons because there's two individuals? So this is sort of the back and forth that we're going through. Well, in that particular case, it says, well, maybe we should we establish this halacha on the question of suspicion and of the building falling or of collapse. And the root word for this you could see is nafal, but you can see that here. And it says, Bechurba chadti. Well, if it's a new ruin, that's an issue, right? Because we just addressed the fact that if it's a new ruin, the collapse may not necessarily be a concern. Or if it says ubitre shere, if it's two kosher individuals, if it's two observant individuals, well, then we shouldn't necessarily be concerned about immorality. Or what's the next one? It says ibitre, and if there are two, mazikim na me leka. If there are two, then the concern over demons is not. There's not a concern because there are two individuals that are present. But then it raises another objection. It says, or another scenario, it says, bim koman haye shinan. Well, what about if this is the abode of demons, a certain place where they gather? So an abandoned building may be the place where demons gather, but maybe there's a special place where it's known that these are the habitations of Shadim. And then it says, the iba'et ema, and if you would say, לעולם בחד ובחורבה, חטי דכה בדברה, דחתה משום חשד לכה דחה אישה, בדברה לה שכיחה. And it continues, ומשום מזיקים איכה. So here, it's looking at a scenario where we have a new ruin that is standing in a field. Let's say in some far-off field, and it says, Dechata mishum chashad. The concern over a suspicion of immorality is not there because in this particular case, Isha bedavra, a woman in the field, la shechicha, is not customary. It's not something that is common because it's not something that apparently women were known to do. If they're far off from the main village or town, it's unlikely for them to be out in a field in a place that's abandoned. And it says, Umishum mazikim ika. Well, if that's the case, then should we then, essentially establish the concern over the demons, back to that scenario? So in essence, the whole purpose of this somewhat complicated, maybe dense section is to look at each of the reasons that are given, and essentially, one might say, to find holes in the argument. If the building is new, are we really concerned about it collapsing? No, but we have to consider the possibility that there may be a concern over suspicion of marit ayin, of the appearance of evil, or of demons. And then a person says, well, if there are two individuals, are we concerned about immorality? Well, it depends. If the individuals are righteous, if the individuals are low moral stature, or if there are two individuals, are we still concerned about demons? Well, it depends. If it's a special habitation, an area that is known to be the dwelling of Shadim or Mazikim, then that still holds true. So it's all these different scenarios. And I think in many ways, even though we may not have something that's profound at the same level of what we saw in Berachot 3a, what we do see here is an analysis of all of the different possibilities, which I think are extremely important. When we look at a pasuk, a verse, when we look at the Mishnah, when we're looking at the Gemara, when we're looking at any issue, we should always try to consider all the different elements and all the different scenarios that might play out. And I think this is a perfect example of this exercise that the rabbis are doing, essentially to find the holes, as I said, but to look at why all of the reasons were provided as the rationale for not entering into a ruin. Now, the discussion changes. We leave that discussion and we continue with a baraita. And it says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. So remember that a baraita is a statement sort of like the Mishnah, but it's not found in the Mishnayot. It's found in the Gemara. But it has weight. It has weight similar to the Mishnah. And it says, Arba mishmarot chave halayla, divrei Rabbi. Now, we started the discussion in Tractate Berachot with the question, when is the time for the recitation of the Shema in the evening? And very quickly, we entered into this discussion of when the Kohanim, the priest, would go in to eat their teruma, and that was followed up by how did that relate to the specific watches of the day and the night. And so here we return to that, which of course is a very, we might say, complicated path to get back to this topic, but it's sort of characteristic of the Gemara. And it says there are 4 watches of the night, and these are the words of Rabbi. So who is Rabbi? It's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is saying that there are 4 watches, which would consist of 3 hours each, but we have an objection. And it says, Rabbi Natan Omer. Rabbi Natan says, Shalosh. No, it's 3. It's 3 watches. So why is there this contention between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor, the editor, the compiler of the Mishnah, and Rabbi Natan? And here we have the question, Mai Tameh de Rabbi Natan. So what is the reasoning? What is the thinking of Rabbi Nathan, or Rabbi Natan? And it says here, Dichtiv, it is written. Remember, this is a reference to a biblical text. And what does it say? It says, Ve'yavo Gidon umea ish asher ito bikse hamachane rosh ha'ashmoret ha'tichona. So this verse says, it's from the book of Judges, Shoftim, and it says, and Gideon came with 100 of his men, and they were on the outside, or the outskirts of the encampment, Rosh Ashmoret, Atichona, at the head of, or at the beginning of the middle watch. The Hatichona is middle. And then we continue, and it says Tana, it was taught. So again, this is another baraita. En tichona ela shayesh lefanecha ul ha'arecha. So again, we're here, tichona ela shayesh lefanecha ul acharecha. There is no middle without something that's before and something that is after. Very simple statement, but it's something that establishes the principle that Rabbi Natan is arguing for. Now, in contrast, we continue, and it says Rabbi, and what is Rabbi Yehuda's position, right? How is he going to answer this question or this objection? It says, "My tichona." What is tichona? What is this middle? And it says, "Achat min hatichona, sheba tichonot." So, according to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, this middle is one of the middles, if that makes sense. We have here sheba tichonot, which are middles, if you will, in plural. And he's saying that, well, the reference to hatichona is simply one of the middles. So that implies that there are 2 watches that are taking place in the night. Now, the discussion or the debate will continue. Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Natan mi ketiv. Where is it written? Rabbi Nathan objects, or Rabbi Natan, tichona sheba tichonot. Where is it written that the middle is one of the middles? If that makes sense. Where is the source for this? And to this, he says, Tichona Ketiv. This is Tichona Ketiv. He says it's written in the middle. It doesn't say plural. It doesn't say Tichonot. And so then it continues. It says, Ma ta'ameh de Rabbi. What is the reasoning, or what is the thinking, if one might say, of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? And I think in many ways, this is sort of the context of this entire discussion. What is the rationale for a particular reason that is given? And I think if you think about that in the context of why you should not enter into a ruin, And that whole exercise, you begin to see the rabbinic mind at play, where they're looking at all of the arguments for and against and trying to come up with an answer. And now we continue, and it says, let's see what else I place here. It says, Amar Rabbi Zarika. So Rabbi Zarika said, Amar Rabbi Ameh, and he's saying essentially that Rabbi Ameh said, and then Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said. So he's giving them credit for the source of his position. And it says, Katuv Echad Omer. It is written in one verse. We can interpret it that way. It says, Chatzot Laila Akum Lechodot Lach Al Mishpete Tzidkecha. Chatzot Laila is in the middle of the night. Akum, this is speaking of Melech David, of King David. At midnight I arise, Lechodot, to praise you, Al Mishpete Tzidkecha, for your righteous judgments or your righteous statutes. Okay, so then we continue. We're in this section here. It says, Vechatuv Echad Omer. And it is written essentially in another verse. It says in one verse, but it's trying to give a contrast. One verse it says at midnight. Another verse it says what? It says, Kid demu enai ashmurot. My eyes preceded ashmurot are what? The watches. Again, now we are looking at plural. So the question is going to be, well, how can there be multiple plurals if there's only one watch? This is the argument that's being made. Haketzad arba'a mishmarot halayla. As a consequence, there are 4 watches of the night according to this position. And then it continues and it says, Rabbi Natan, so Rabbi Nathan, Savar la ke Rabbi Yehoshua. So it's basically, what is the reasoning, one might say, of Rabbi Yehoshua? Or he's thinking about, Rabbi Natan is sort of arguing that it's not exactly what is meant. This is sort of my reading into the text. And it says, Ditnan, it is taught. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, because Rabbi Yehoshua said, Ad shalosh sha'ot, sheken derech melachim la'amod b'shalosh sha'ot. So what Rabbi Nathan is doing, Rabbi Natan is saying, yes, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said this, but he also said this other phrase. And now, in essence, we have to interpret one against the other. And it says, Ad shalosh sha'ot, until the 3rd hour, sheken derech melachim, it is the way of kings, la'amod, b'shalosh sha'ot, to stand, to rise in the 3rd hour. So the implication is that a king doesn't get up at, shall we say, 6 o'clock in the morning as a generic time frame for sunrise. He's a king, he's royalty, right? So he gets up in a leisurely way much later than the servants that serve him. And it says here, Shet de lelia vetarte de maima. So 6 of the night and 2 of the day. Havu lachushate mishmarot. So for Rabbi Nathan, Rabbi Natan is saying, you've got 6 hours that belong to the night, 12 to 6, and then 2 from the day, 6 to 8. And if you have 8 hours, you divide them into 4, you get 2. So you have 2 watches. And why is this important? Because what we saw up here when we were looking at King David is that he says, Kidemu enai ashmurot. Ashmurot, it means that my eyes preceded the watches. And this is important because for Rabbi Natan, this essentially resolves the conflict. Yes, Rabbi Yehoshua is stating one position that seems to support the views of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but if we interpret them in the context of what else, other things that Rabbi Yehoshua has said, it's not an issue. What David is saying is, I get up at 12 and I'm looking forward into the future, and what I actually see is 2 watches. I'm getting up so early before everybody else. I'm staying up. I see 2 watches ahead. So let's continue here, and I think we'll do one more section before we transition to another part of the conversation. And it says here, Rab Ashe Amar, so Rabbi Ashe says, Mishmara ufalga name mishmarot karu lechu. And what does this mean? Ufalga means like half. So what he's saying is that even half a watch, half of the watches at night, they are still called one of the watches. So even if there was only 1.5 watches left, they would say there's still 2. So this is sort of like another approach to resolving that issue. And then now the conversation switches again. And it's sort of interesting why this happens, but this is sort of the tendency, the flow of these rabbinic discussions. And it says, Ve'amar Rabbi Zarika, Rabbi Zarika said, Amar Rabbika Ameh. So he's basically saying, in the name of Rabbi Ameh, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. So again, we're giving, recognition to the individuals who have transmitted this perspective. And it says something which seems completely out of context, but this is the flow that we're looking at. And it says, En omarim mipinecha met ela devarav shel met. You shouldn't say anything before the dead. You shouldn't talk about something before the dead. And then it continues, Amar Rabbi Abba bar Kahana. And Rabbi Abba bar Kahana said, La amaram eled b'divrei Torah, that this is, we shouldn't be talking about words of Torah. Aval miled alma let lanba. That's really the concern, because not these other issues. If you're talking about things that are essentially, we should only be talking what says here, Ela devara shel met. We should only be talking about words that are related to the duties that are necessary to attend to the dead. This is in the previous section. Here, we're saying you shouldn't speak words of Torah, but other things that are related to other topics, they're not a concern. And the interesting aspect of this is that, in many ways, it's a sign of respect for the dead not to talk about the Torah. Why is this, according to this view? Because the dead cannot partake of Torah study. And so there's this idea that they're not able to fulfill that mitzvah because, of course, they're already deceased. And so it's not appropriate to discuss words of holiness in that particular context for those that are not able to participate in that. So it's a very interesting section. We went from discussing the prohibitions on entering into a ruin. We switched back to the conversation of how many watches are in the night. And then I have my son here with me. We began to discuss the question of what is appropriate to speak before those who have deceased. So we'll continue this discussion in the future. I wanted to sort of break this down a little bit further in a slower pace to give a little bit more context, because I know that the sparseness or the brevity of sometimes the words that the Gemara uses can be confusing. So I hope that helps in some sense give this passage a little bit more context. How are we going to do the video? What's the video? Play.